Can you fight a pandemic without rolling back freedom? Is government surveillance necessary to stop the spread? In short, is the coronavirus a threat to democracy? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. The coronavirus pandemic is causing a worldwide crisis for democracy. That's the conclusion of Freedom House, the U.S.-based research group. Its annual survey identifies 80 nations where democracy or human rights have been curtailed since the virus emerged at the end of last year. They are highlighted in red. Gray areas represent countries largely unchanged. Freedom House says the rights abuses weren't only reported in countries with authoritarian regimes, but others rated as being free. The Freedom House survey focuses on 5 main areas it says have weakened during the pandemic. They are checks against abuses of power, protection of vulnerable groups, government transparency, media freedom, and credible elections. World leaders are accused of failing to be transparent about the impact of the coronavirus, prompting public distrust and allowing misinformation to spread. Citizens face limits on free speech and government abuses of power are rising, says the survey, adding that pandemic restrictions disproportionately affect marginalized communities and minority groups. The disease has disrupted elections, and some governments have used that to their advantage. And looking ahead, the imposition of new laws may be blamed on the pandemic, but they can't be easily reversed. So the survey says the crisis in democracy is likely to continue long after the coronavirus is under control. All right, let's bring in our guests. In New York, Amy Slipowitz is research manager at Freedom House and co-author of the report Democracy Under Lockdown. In New Delhi, Kavita Krishnan is secretary of the All India Progressive Women's Association and author of Fearless Freedom. And in Kiev, Ivar is senior policy advisor at Norwegian Helsinki Committee. Welcome to the program. Amy, let me start with you. This decline in democracy around the world that is being highlighted in your reporting, this is something that started happening long before the COVID-19 pandemic, correct?
That's right. Freedom House also produces an annual publication called Freedom in the World, and it looks at every country and its political rights and civil liberties. So what it has found is that over the past 14 years, global freedoms have been in decline. So COVID-19 is an exacerbation of this trend.
Kavita, the report cites specifically the Indian government as a government that is scapegoating marginalized groups. The report talks about how India's Muslims were labeled as super spreaders of COVID-19 and subjected to a hate campaign. How bad is the situation there?
It's been very bad, and just as Amy said, it is not something that is unique to the COVID-19 pandemic. It's been happening ever since 2014, when we have had a far-right Hindu supremacist regime in power, and it was re-elected in 2019, headed by Narendra Modi. So this is a regime that, yes, used COVID-19, weaponized COVID-19 to scapegoat Muslim minorities and claim that they were super spreaders, and this was done with the help of a absolutely captive media, electronic media, television media, and so on. But I think that beyond that, there's also other things that are happening during the pandemic, which are also disproportionately affecting Muslims, but also dissenting voices and progressive activists. Just before the pandemic hit, there was a massive historic movement that the world had noticed in India against a discriminatory anti-Muslim citizenship law that sought to make Muslims second-class citizens in India. This movement, when the pandemic hit, naturally the movement had to take a backseat. You couldn't be out in large numbers on the streets. And so you have had the government then subsequently cracking down on activists of that movement, disproportionately Muslims, but not only Muslims, and arresting them and claiming that their activism was something that was was a conspiracy to create a riot. And so they are being blamed for the anti-Muslim violence that Delhi witnessed during Donald Trump's visit in February.
Ivar, what's the level of concern currently in Europe? Because in Hungary, Prime Minister Viktor Orban passed an act that gave him absolute powers to rule by decree. There's also concerns about democratic backsliding in Poland as well, right?
Yeah, I mean, as Amy mentioned in the beginning, this trend isn't something that started with the pandemic, of course, but it's something that has probably made it worse. And I think that Europeans who follow the democracy situation and the respect for human rights in European countries and in the larger Eurasian region are concerned that once the pandemic is over, we'll be at a much worse point than we were when it started. So I think that when the pandemic is over, clearly the world will go back and see what was our preparedness really like in terms of public health and all these things that are very important. But I think at that point we also need to stop and say, where were we human rights wise when this began, and are we now in a place that is much worse? And what, if so, are we going to do to put things back the way they were again, hopefully better in time?
Amy, one of the more interesting things in the report is it doesn't just talk about countries where authoritarianism is on the rise. You also cite some examples of countries like Tunisia and Georgia. These are countries that are struggling democracies that have been widely commended for taking healthcare measures during this pandemic without abusing freedoms. Are you hopeful that we could see more of that going forward?
Yeah, there is some hope. The country doesn't have to be an established democracy to be able to tackle the pandemic in a transparent, clear, non-discriminate manner. There have been a lot of cases where journalists have really courageously been reporting on government abuses, protests in support of democratic reform have persisted despite restrictions. So there is some room for hope there.
Kavita, last month, the Press Club of India issued a statement expressing concern that the government in India was criminalizing dissent. From your vantage point now, has this gotten worse during the pandemic?
It has gotten immensely worse. And I also want to say that it has not gotten worse because the government wanted to tackle the pandemic. It's much worse than that, because one of the basic things that many institutions, including the WHO, spoke about was that you should be trying to depopulate your jails, right? But ours is a government, the Modi regime in India, which took pains to try and arrest people during the pandemic, arrest activists during the pandemic, including one pregnant young woman, but also several other young students and older activists as well, and put them in jails at this time. So they have arrested in Delhi alone some 20 activists who were leading activists of the, and that witch hunt is still on. So, I'm absolutely in agreement with this. And the other thing I want to say is that they're also arresting journalists. For instance, there is one young journalist, a very good journalist called Prashant Panogia, who is known for his reporting on about the lives of India's oppressed castes. And he is somebody who has been arrested by the Uttar Pradesh government, the government of a state called Uttar Pradesh. And he's been in jail for now a month and counting for no crime at all except for a tweet that was critical of the government. The other thing I want to quickly highlight is that you may be aware that there's a huge movement building up in India against a rape of a woman of an oppressed caste in Uttar Pradesh in a place called Hathras. There, the Uttar Pradesh government declared the whole village to be a COVID containment zone in order to prevent opposition leaders from being able to visit the bereaved family and from preventing people from oppressed castes from protesting and feminists from protesting. But they have allowed dominant caste people to hold large intimidatory gatherings against the oppressed castes. However, they have also, among the people arrested, are also leading young feminist activists of India who are also in jails, arrested under a law under which you can't get bail and you can remain in jail endlessly for years on some absurd charge till your trial starts, and the trial may not start till 5 or 7 years later. That's a law called the UAPA.
Ivar, health measures taken by governments around the world during this pandemic mean that populations are surveilled in a way they had not been before, that there's an increasing amount of surveillance of populations around the world. Whether these are done by apps that are used to contact trace, or whether it's just officials, health officials, government officials going house to house in different countries, checking populations. How worrying is it for you that these measures could potentially be abused?
Well, the pandemic has led to discussions on this, even in established democracies like Norway, where people are concerned about the amount of personal data that you're sharing through apps that are intended, of course, to do good, to help curb the spread of the virus. I'm probably more concerned about the way that this can be used in the regimes very far east in Eurasia, countries like Kazakhstan and Tajikistan, but also in more emerging authoritarian directions. Like you mentioned, Hungary and Poland at the outset. Because I think if you look at more the traditional authoritarian regimes, you'll see that they of course don't really feel like they need a reason to place a ban on freedom of assembly, for example. But even these countries do have they do think about the PR effect to a certain extent. So when they can point to something like the coronavirus and say, we are not doing this as an authoritarian measure, we're doing it to protect the population's health, then that's just all the better for them. And the same tactic, I'm sure, will be gladly used by countries that are moving in a more authoritarian direction and where democracy is at stake.
Amy, let me ask you to expand a little bit on what Ivar is saying, because we're looking at the increase of the surveillance state, but also on the flip side of that, let me ask you about the proper use of that type of data. I mean, there is general agreement and consensus that it's a good thing when governments leverage technology to control the virus through things like contact tracing, that it enables them to give more effective treatment to the population. How are you able to strike the balance between utilizing that data and that technology properly and then its opposite, which is a complete surveillance state?
It's a difficult balance to strike, and there have also been studies showing that using this type of technology might not necessarily be effective. But if it is, it's really important to clearly state where data is going, make sure it's firewalled against other uses by different authorities and agencies in the government. So basically making sure the data protection is very strong and can't be misused, and ensuring that the data is deleted after a certain period as well.
Kavita, this rolling back of civil liberties that we're seeing, I mean, this is not just happening in dictatorships. This is happening in democracies as well, in different parts of the world, correct?
I think that, the Indian example is a case in point where I think the world is told to be reassured that India is this thriving democracy because it holds elections. But I think just as a commentator in the Time magazine this time commented on India's Prime Minister, saying that the test of a democracy is not how you treat those who voted for the victor, but those who did not. How does it treat those who did not vote for the winning party? And so I think that in India right now, you're having a regime that is fast trying to eliminate all kinds of critical voices. It doesn't, and that this doesn't just go for India's opposition parties, political opposition parties. It goes for small groups. It goes for it goes for intellectuals on campuses. It goes for students. Anybody who is seen as a potential, somebody who can articulate opinion against the government effectively. That person, including journalists, are seen as a threat. And also in the wake of COVID-19, the government is suppressing data. We just had an Indian Parliament session where the government is saying, we don't have data on how many migrant workers died because of our suddenly declared lockdown and where migrant workers had to walk home. We don't have data on how many doctors, nurses, sanitation workers died during the pandemic. We don't have data on any of these things. But we have an 11 lakh page charge sheet, police charge sheet, against a small bunch of students and intellectuals who worked for peace during a riot in Delhi. And now they're being blamed for that riot, for that targeted violence against Muslims. So this tells you where the government's priorities are. And I think that we need to look a little more closely. All of us need to look a little more closely at the good news that we are told about, democracies and countries. We need to look beyond regular elections and so on, and look more closely at whether or not critical free speech and free protests, or freedom to protest, is being allowed or not.
Amy, is there anything that particularly surprised you during the researching of this report?
I wouldn't say there were that many surprises. I think just tracking what has been happening, it was pretty clear that the pandemic has really exacerbated the decline in democracy. One thing that really interested me, though, was some of these restrictions we found on the media were taking place when journalists were attempting to report on discriminatory enforcement of lockdowns, for example, or treatment of migrants or asylum seekers under lockdown, really trying to stifle forms of accountability in the face of government abuses.
Ivar, we've seen more and more the issue of COVID-19 and the pandemic become politicized in the United States. This is a country that's considered a beacon of democracy. If the situation is as bad as it is there, what does that mean for the rest of the world?
Absolutely. We have the big demonstrations, anti-government protests happening now in Belarus, in the neighboring country of Ukraine, where I am at the moment. And they at least partially started because of anger at the way that the authorities were handling the COVID-19 situation. So I think it's hard to imagine it become quite as extreme, as polarized, perhaps, as it is in the United States. But we see in many countries, including in Norway, there are stark, differences in how the different parties or political groups see how this should be managed. And further east, I'm sure there are definitely differences in opinion on where human rights fit into all of this, whether human rights should be set aside in such situations, or whether we must keep making sure that they are respected even in situations the world has been in over the past year.
Kavita, you've spoken a lot about marginalized communities, vulnerable groups. Let's talk about one of the most vulnerable populations in the world right now, refugees. How will all this impact them? Because they've been so stigmatized the past several years by so many governments. And now, in this reporting from Freedom House, it states that many countries are stigmatizing them further. How dire is the situation for refugees right now?
I think it's an extremely dire situation. And just using one instance from my neighborhood, the Rohingya refugees, who are stateless persons in Myanmar and who then seek refuge in neighboring countries, including India. In India, the ruling Hindu supremacist party makes an easy scapegoat of them. It has used dehumanizing language like termites and so on for Rohingya refugees, as well as for people of Muslim people who speak Bengali, whom they claim are Bangladeshi infiltrators. So, for refugees, they use the word infiltrators. And termites and so on. So this kind of dehumanizing language has been going on for a while. But now what happens is that it is possible to medicalize this whole stigmatization and say that, they are a source of disease, they are a source of virus, they are a source of spreading of a disease and so on. And so, this added layer of stigmatization of refugees and of denial of care, where the government says, we have only so much healthcare to give, and so you can't expect us to care for foreigners. You can't expect us to provide care to foreigners, and so on. So this kind of thing, we are seeing this kind of thing happening in, I think, many countries, and certainly the situation of refugees, including in South Asia, is of great concern.
Amy, Kavita just mentioned Rohingya refugees. The Rohingya, of course, are one of the world's most persecuted minorities. Now, that's one thing when you're talking about refugees in places like Bangladesh or India or other countries, but your reporting also talks about the adverse effects that the pandemic has had as far as not allowing, international bodies to try and stop the abuse that the Rohingya are facing in Myanmar as well, correct?
That's correct. The report found that while the international attention is really turned to addressing the pandemic, a lot of abuses have been able to take place while stakeholders are really looking away. So in Western Myanmar, for example, security services are able to really step up their abuse of Rohingya and escape attention as the world is focused on public health matters.
Ivar, I want to ask you to pick up on something that Kavita had been talking about, which is journalists being gone after in different countries. Do you expect that the situation for journalists is going to worsen around the world right now?
I think that their situation can quickly become more difficult. Because that goes with the more authoritarian a country becomes, the people on the front line are often the journalists, and they are the ones who often feel the effects of it before anyone else does. So I'm hoping that once the pandemic is over, I think that indexes, for example, like Freedom House are doing, where they are particularly looking at the situation for freedom of the media and journalists, are very important and are just going to become more important because we will be able to go back and see, to what degree has the situation become worsened before and after the pandemic. And the same goes really for another area, which is the various committees in the UN who are now suffering under a lack of funding for their reviews. They will also be very important in establishing to what extent has the situation for example, journalists gotten worse in the course of the pandemic, where you can go back and you can look at the previous reporting period, which countries had particularly bad pressure against the media, against independent media, which countries had higher numbers of arrests of journalists than others, and see whether this actually has gotten worse or not.
Amy, let me go to you. We only have a couple of minutes left. Your report says that what is happening in Sri Lanka currently is really illustrative of global trends. What exactly has been going on there?
Yeah, in Sri Lanka, the Rajapaksas have really been able to intensify their authoritarian agenda over the past few months. They've been doing things like controlling independent reporting, stifling unfavorable speech. But what really illustrates this is the calling of early elections, which were actually had to be postponed under COVID-19. So this left the national legislature out of session beyond the constitutional deadline, allowing the executive to kind of rule without this oversight and much fewer checks on the power. And then at the same time, as we mentioned, Muslims have been suffering from very intense scapegoating within the country. They've been labeled as super spreaders. The media has singled out cases where Muslims contracted the virus. So that there are really a bunch of aspects in Sri Lanka that kind of illustrate some of those issues that we highlight, including abuse of power, restrictions against marginalized communities, stifling of the press, and elections that have been held with some kind of undermining of their credibility.
All right, we've run out of time, so we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks so much to all our guests, Amy Slipowitz, Kavita Krishnan, and Ivar Dale. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Mohammed Jamjoom, and the whole team here, bye for now.